Hello, Jordan Lawrence of The Lawrence Perspective, coming to you from an entirely different seat in my living room. I have to say, I think I like the couch more, but just for stimulation purposes, I'm going to try to keep the audience stimulated by moving to different locations within the living room. So today I want to talk about some really rudimentary boring supply and demand basics of economics, but then use what is basically going to be a 3-minute primer in the basic fundamentals of supply and demand to explain everything that has happened economically over the past year and a half, since the pandemic, and then take that same lens and project out into the future two scenarios that are possible. And it's quite clear to me after some coffee this morning and some great reading of some economic theory that there are two scenarios that are going to unfold. And it's really clear. One or the other are going to happen. And we're really leaning towards one of the two scenarios even. So excited to unwrap this whole thing. And we'll see if I can get through it all in one sit down, one recording, one discussion. It's possible I have to break this up, but we'll see how it goes. So let's take, just for example, a phenomenon we're all really acutely familiar with. And we can choose from two. Gas shortages, especially if you're in the Southeast, or better yet, paper towel and toilet paper shortages, which we all experienced in the United States. And it was a totally shitty thing to experience, to put it bluntly. So all of a sudden, you start going to stores and the shelves are completely cleared out. And this is because of really the virus. But how did the virus lead to this whole scenario? Well, largely the virus led to a big shock in the system. And that shock comprised of both a demand and a supply shock. But all of a sudden, people pulled out of the workforce. Truck drivers maybe stopped driving. People didn't work in manufacturing plants. Things were disrupted all the way from the production side to the entire supply chains that brought these paper products to grocery stores and department stores, et cetera, et cetera. So that disruption certainly affected the supply and brought that supply down. Now, the normal way in which this is resolved is that if supply comes down, but demand, we're still wiping tables and wiping other things that require toilet paper and paper towels. So demand, let's say, is relatively static and it stayed at the same level. People don't need those things more or less than they did before the crisis. They just need them at the same level. But the supply has come down. So generally what happens when you don't have enough supply to satiate demand is the price goes up, and a rising in price, the price goes way up, should bring down demand. People are maybe going to be a little more frugal with their purchases. They're not going to buy a 6-month supply, for example, like when there's a panic and then everyone panic buys and you immediately run out. So what happens? Well, for some reason in the United States, we don't accept that prices should rise when supply goes down anymore because we call it price gouging. So what do? You get the only other alternative. You say, okay, we're going to keep supply, demand is here, supply is here. Eventually, demand is going to overtake the supply, and you're going to end up at zero, hence empty shelves, and no one gets anything. So what happened was, instead of raising prices to bring demand down, because we don't accept raising prices when there's a supply shortage anymore for some insane reason, so what basically happened was demand stayed at that level. We wiped out all of supply. And people, if you had the opportunity, you could go buy 6 months supply, because why wouldn't you? It's the same price as it's always been. If that roll of toilet paper was $8, you probably wouldn't buy 6 months because you'd think, this whole problem is going to resolve itself in 30, 60, 90 days. I might as well just be frugal in the meantime until prices normalize and then buy as much of this crap as I want. But because we've accepted that prices don't rise, what you get is empty shelves. You get nothing. And that's what happens with gas. And oh, by the way, that's what's happening in Europe with everything right now. They're seeing way more of this, complete elimination of supply. And like at the gas pump across England, places like that, it's becoming a real serious problem. So let me take just this one example, and I know I had lots of editorial feedback in there, but let's just kind of accept this supply and demand basic fundamental, and that when you don't have enough supply and you have too much demand and vice versa, there's an imbalance, and that imbalance has to be resolved. Let's take that and kind of look through what happened during the pandemic, and then we can look at this scenario A and B of where we're going in the future, all through this same lens. So, the virus was a phenomenal shock to the system. And at the time, in the midst of it, I was sitting at the beach and I was all jacked up on coffee, and I said, this is going to be an economic collapse. There is just no way around it. And I didn't account for something there. And so that misaccounting is something really important to the whole equation here. So my thinking at the time was the virus both affected supply and demand. Notably, they both dropped. Production dropped. People's uncertainty about the future meant they pulled back on producing. They pulled back on hiring. They said, we're going to let the supply come down because there was a demand shock. All of a sudden, people were scared. They're not spending money. The savings rate went way up, right? Because people are not spending money. They're battening down the hatches for what is a really scary scenario. And really, the reaction was right. It was on target. There was tons of excess in the system, and anyone but the commentary on Bloomberg will agree that there's tons of excess in the system, whether it's debt, leverage, corporate spending, buybacks, all this stuff. I mean, there's tons of excess in the system, and the virus served as a check on that excess, and supply and demand were coming down. And yes, we were going to probably experience a couple year adjustment period. Let those levels come back down. Oh, by the way, this is also deflationary. It brings all prices down. If you, just one other aside here, if you want to look at what's wrong in the economy today, and why is it so hard for people at the bottom to get ahead, but people at the top are doing very well, it's exclusively a price problem. Prices are too high. High asset prices, great for really wealthy people. High asset prices, horrible for people that don't currently have assets and need to get into the system. You can't afford a home. You can't afford stocks. You can't afford all the things that have already risen appreciably. And the people that already own those things are doing very well. So when this big shock of the virus hit the system, a very deflationary process happened. Supply and demand both come down, and prices collapse along with that. And then you have this reset that happens, and maybe it takes a couple of years, but then all of a sudden you have this more level playing field, and people at the middle and the bottom can be a more equal footing than those at the top, because the asset owners get hit really hard when prices come down. And really the people at the bottom that have no assets, maybe they don't get hit as hard. They might be faced with unemployment and other challenges, but eventually those lower prices are going to give them an opportunity to get into assets, and it's going to be a more even distribution of wealth. So the virus was creating this organic change that we needed. We needed this thing to happen. But what happened instead? Well, shortly after the whole thing hit, there was this shock. There was a supply and demand came down, but very shortly after, within 60 days, there was the government stepping in and the Federal Reserve stepping in and saying, we got to do something. And what do they know how to do? They know how to print and send money out to the entire economy. So they dumped and pushed this wall of money into the system. So what does that do? Well, when you push a wall of money into the system, think back to supply and demand. Demand does this, right? Supply, and it's not like an evenly ratcheting up thing. No, we never before seen unprecedented wall of money entered into the system. And so demand all of a sudden jumps up. There's this people have money. They're not working, by the way. They're not necessarily producing more goods. They're not, the factories and the engine that creates the goods that we need to purchase when demand goes way up wasn't functioning yet. But all of a sudden the money was there, the demand was there to buy those things. So what do we have? We have massive shortages, and we're really on the tail end of still experiencing that. I mean, there are shortages of goods all over the economy, and especially discretionary spending, durable goods. If you look at, this is something I looked at in the last video, if you look at consumer spending and especially on physical goods, things for your home and whatnot, where people are living. I bought some shit, it's in the background here. So the spending on all that stuff went through the roof. There's supply shock, there's shortages, there's this whole supply chain phenomenon that, by the way, the supply chain phenomenon is just a demand phenomenon. If you want to dive into that deeper, I went crazy on it in my last video, so feel free to go take a look at it. But this demand phenomenon is causing all these shortages, and there's all of a sudden, it's like the economy isn't functioning. We can't get basic things that we're used to always being able to get, and that is because the artificial stimulation of tons of money entering the system, but that money is not derived from production and the things that normally create more wealth. And so all of a sudden you have this imbalance. You don't have this natural system where supply and demand are moving up gradually together. You have this like total imbalance that is leads to shortages and the problems we're seeing here in the United States, we probably continue to see, but acutely is being seen now in Western Europe. So let's take this kind of phenomenon of the supply-demand equation, what's happened now, today, and what we're experiencing with the supply chain problems and the inventory issues, and let's project that out into the future. And this is what I call scenario A and B, two potential options. And it could be that scenario A happens in the United States and scenario B happens in places like Western Europe, and that's kind of what my theory is. So scenario A. Scenario A is that what happens is the economy does react eventually, right? So we have this demand at this really high level from all this money that's poured into the system. Well, guess what? Manufacturing and the supply side of the economy, it is catching up gradually. Demand is at this really, really high level, and the supply side of the equation, the producers of goods, they're starting to believe that demand is here to stay, and so they're gradually raising inventory levels. Well, there's a problem. That demand isn't real. That demand isn't here to stay. Just earlier this week, it was reported that of the enhanced unemployment benefits, we dropped from 11 million people receiving those to 5. So 6 million people all of a sudden not receiving direct payments and checks, and yet employment didn't improve, so they're not necessarily working either. So this demand that came from a wall of money, well, the wall of money has stopped, or it's slowing down. They're not sending checks out to people directly. So supply is correcting to reach this extremely high level of demand, but is this high level of demand sustainable? This is where we get to scenario A and B. Are they going to pass infrastructure bills, and are they going to pass new bills in Congress to mail checks to people more and put it into your bank account and pay and just flood money into the system? I don't know. It's starting to look like that's not going to happen in the United States, at least. And so as all of a sudden this slower process of getting the manufacturing engine and the supply side built up, it's getting up to speed, the demand could drop, you could have an oversupply. And what does it mean when you have a lot of supply and not enough demand? It means prices drop. That is deflationary. It means liquidation. It crushes corporate profits. It's a recession. And it's really just us, eating the porridge that we made by screwing with the outcomes of the virus and sending people money and not letting the system just move along naturally and do this readjustment that it needed to do. So that's scenario A. I actually think that's the base case for what's going to happen in the United States, that demand is not going to be maintained at the levels where it is, and that supply is going to ramp up, only to be met with falling demand, and you're going to have kind of a deflationary scenario. But there is a very good chance that scenario B could happen as well. And I think really scenario B is going to unfold in other parts of the world, and that maybe it is already in some sense. And scenario B is this. Scenario B is the direct payments and the government stimulus keeps coming. And remember, this is in the context of not necessarily more people being employed, more goods being produced. If less people are working, but they have the same amount of money as before, the demand is up here, but the supply can't come up. There's massive labor shortages. whether it's look at supply chain, warehousing, trucking, manufacturing, they're all desperate for labor, and they need the entry level labor. That's what they're desperate for. They don't have it. There's not enough people willing to work and fulfill those positions to reach these demand levels. So if you maintain these demand levels at the height where they are today by continuing this subsidy system, which is really popular in Europe and probably more accepted generally in Western Europe, where sending people money to not work is maybe a little more accepted there than the United States. I don't know, it's starting to get hard to distinguish one place from the other. But what this could be, scenario B, is where demand stays here, supply stays here, and eventually demand consumes supply, and you end up with shortages and you end up with nothing. And that is a horrible scenario. That is why they don't have gasoline in Europe. And when you don't have gasoline, by the way, you have further breakdown. It's a knock-on effect. Everything is sequential. Not only it's an inconvenient, I can't fill up my car. No, you can't fill up the trucks that need to move the goods in an already constrained supply chain that doesn't have enough labor. You put more pressure on supply by maintaining artificial demand. So maintaining demand at this artificially high level actually pushes supply down in all of these complex ways. Hard to even piece together all the different links in the chain that create that scenario, and you just run out of things, you have nothing. And let me tell you, I don't want to live in a place like Venezuela and maybe, obviously that's, there's a little hyperbole there. I don't think we're going to be faced with the Venezuela scenario, but just not being able to get basic things at your store is an extremely frustrating scenario. And I think most people would be happy to pay a slightly higher price to be able to maintain some supply rather than zero supply. But, that's really a political decision, and it's outside the realm of economics. Economics simply tells you what's going to happen between supply and demand. And what's going to happen is either scenario A or scenario B. We're going to have a supply shock, which leads to a deflationary scenario, which is really the washout that we should have had with the coronavirus. It's just we're going to get the consequences that we deserved. I believe it was called The Banquet of Consequences by a guy Charles Hugh Smith, who's written an interesting blog post on why he believes we're entering the deflationary scenario. And he believes we're entering it now today. I'm not so certain of that, but it's certainly possible. But we're either going to receive those banquet of consequences that we deferred by sending people money or the virus, or we're going to get this kind of new dysfunctional normal where demand is higher than supply and you run out of things, and we limp along through this dysfunctional society until somewhere in the stagflation, there is this another kind of reset that enters economically, and things finally correct themselves. But either way, scenario A or B aren't looking too hot, and I really think that there's no way to completely avoid either. It seems that one of these two things is going to have to happen. It's very interesting to see that the timing of when this happens and how it plays out. Like I said, the supply shortages in Europe, I think that some of that we could see here, where all of a sudden take a look at the price of natural gas. I'll try to splash that on the screen here for you, but natural gas, insane price appreciation. In Europe it was 400% over its 10-year average. I mean, what's happening is that prices reflecting where prices are allowed to work, which is still in most of the economy, unlike toilet paper and other things like maybe gasoline. Where prices are allowed to work, they're skyrocketing. Where they're not allowed to work, you have zero, you run out of goods. And so this level where, again, if you allow things to happen in sequence, if you allow bankruptcy and if you allow recessions and growth cycles to happen as they naturally do, then you get this scenario where things go like this. The economy goes up and down, and you have good days and you have bad days. And largely that's a good thing because it prevents consolidation of wealth in one group. But, we have this economy now that's doing this, and things are far out of whack. And instead of this evenly rotating, we're going to get some major shock gyrations, and it's not going to be fun, but it's going to happen. And I feel very high conviction that one of these two scenarios is going to play out. hope that we have some growth boom through, discovery of new energy source or something like that disregards all these other consequences. But barring anything phenomenal like that, we're going to be faced with, again, to use Charles Hugh Smith's words, the banquet of consequences that we cooked up over COVID. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed this talk. I certainly was excited to bring it to you from, again, an entirely new place in the living room. This is Jordan Lawrence of The Lawrence Perspective, and I will chat again soon. Thanks.